Hi everyone, I'm just waiting for a few more participants to join us, watching the numbers come up, and we'll get properly started in a moment. All right, so my name is Stephanie Lusby. I'm a research fellow here at ARCSHS at La Trobe, and as we come together to meet today for today's seminar, as always, we acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we're all meeting from today. I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay respects to their elders past and present, and to the elders of the lands that you're all meeting from today, and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us for this session. This land is unceded land, and it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. We are very lucky today to be joined by Professor Kath Albury for the first of a new set of seminars, a new series of seminars from ARCSHS. And before I introduce Kath, I'd just like to say thank you to Dr. Renee Fermati for her work with the previous series, and for helping me with a smooth transition moving into the coordinating role. So Kath Albury is going to be talking to us today about automating safety and consent in digital dating culture, reflections on everyday negotiations of safety, risk and wellbeing. And this presentation comes from several years of work that Kath has been doing. She's an associate investigator with the Centre for Automated Decision Making and Society at Swinburne University of Technology, and co-leads the Digital Participation and Inclusion Program in Swinburne's Social Innovation and Research Institute. Kath's going to speak for around 40 minutes, and then we'll have some time for questions and discussions at the end. So please make sure to keep note of burning questions and clever reflections that we can hear when Kath's finished talking. And Kath, I'll hand over to you.
Great, thank you so much. And I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where I live and work, the Wurundjeri Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and to also pay my respects to all the First Nations people who are part of this webinar today. I'm going to present today some of the findings from some work I've been doing over a few years now. I'm hoping my screen is sharing. Is it, Stephanie? Yeah, awesome, thank you. And the presentation has two sections. The first section, I'm going to give a bit of an overview of the key findings of the Safety, Risk and Wellbeing on Dating Apps project. And in the second half of the presentation, I'm going to share some more recent reflections on dating apps, data, safety and consent, particularly thinking about automation and safety by design in dating apps. And that's work I've been working on in collaboration with a number of colleagues from the ARC Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making and Society, which is a cross-institutional group and includes Rosalie Gillett and Zara Stardust at QUT. And we are developing a work in progress looking at dating apps, surveillance and justice. And another project I've been working on with Jean Burgess, Anthony McCosker and Rowan Wilkin, which is focused on intimate data cultures. The first half of the presentation has slides. The second half has no slides. And if you hear any carrying on in the background, that is my dog, who always mucks up whenever we are webinaring, but we're all lockdown champions now and we know how that goes. So I'm going to start, as I said, by introducing our project, Safety, Risk and Wellbeing on Dating Apps. But I'm going to reflect as I move on on some of the more recent conversations that we've seen in popular media in Australia and elsewhere around user experiences of safety and risk on apps and in-app cultures, and also some of the very highly publicised announcements that were made earlier this year by the New South Wales Police, most kind of prominently around some strategies or proposed strategies for automating consent through the use of apps and plugins, or sharing or increasing surveillance, perhaps you might say, of in-app messaging by sharing messaging content with police. So I'm going to come back to that in the second half of the presentation. But first, as I said, I'll talk about our study, which informs my reflections in the second half of the paper. This was a 2-year project funded by the Australian Research Council with my Swinburne colleague Anthony McCosker and Kane Race from Sydney Uni as CIs. We were partnered with Acon Health and Family Planning New South Wales. At the time I put the project together, I was at the University of New South Wales. I didn't live in Victoria, hence the New South Wales partners. And we had, as you can see, a really tremendous team of supporters and collaborators working on the project, including Tim Wark, Jessica Botfield and Doreen Salon from Family Planning New South Wales and Acon, and some fantastic research supporters, Paul Byron, Tanoni Pym, Jarrett Walsh, Christopher Dietzel, Daniel Readers and Son Vivienne. And we also had some extraordinary support in 2020 when we worked on an extension of the project, which I can talk about a little later on. Team from Yakvik and also Teddy Cook, Elvoyd and Gabe Curtis assisted with that second stage. And the project overall was a mixed methods extravaganza. So we ran online consultations with 4 reference groups, and this was pre-COVID, but was really helpful in that we used a great online platform called Focus Group IT, which is in some ways very low tech, but great for asynchronous research consultation. And we had 2 reference groups of professionals, health professionals, and 2 of app users. I should say that those reference group consultations were really useful for us because they allowed us to co-design some of the research questions and methods, but also gave us a great forum for kind of sense checking as we went along and helped shape our knowledge translation and our findings towards the end of the project. We also conducted a literature review of public health research on dating and hookup apps, which I'm not going to talk about today, but is outlined in our report. We conducted a media review of reporting on dating and hookup apps, and that was based on 6,000 journalistic reports on dating apps, which has been published, and I'll share the details of that in a second. A very small survey of dating app users, and a number of participatory research workshops with app users, and there were 9 overall, all with app users aged 18 to 35, mostly in urban and regional New South Wales, but some later in Victoria. And following the research workshop process, we also conducted in-depth interviews with app users in both New South Wales and Victoria. And the final part of the project involved knowledge translation workshops with sexual health and education professionals. So, and that also allowed us to elicit additional data around organizational, what you might term literacy in relation to digital platforms. And that was a really useful part of the process first. So there are a number of publications which are outlined here. And if anyone doesn't have access to these publications or these journals and would like access, I'm very happy for you to contact me and I can send them to you. The project report, however, is publicly available on the APO, which is the Analysis and Policy Observatory. So I'm just going to give a brief overview of the findings, and I'm going to start out by giving an overview of our media analysis. So this is a visualization, a little bit dodgy, sorry, my slide's gone a bit wonky, of the media analysis process, and this has been published in Health Sociology Review. The article is called Dating Apps as Public Health Problems, so you can find it there if this is unclear or if it's something you'd like to follow up on. But this was an analysis of a data set of 6,000 articles on broadly around dating apps, and we filtered that down to look in depth at a smaller data set. Obviously, we couldn't do a close reading of 6,000 articles, but we identified in that data set 3 key themes overall of the way dating apps are discussed in popular media. The first section we classified as reporting or conversations about risk. And the reason we did this, I should say, is that it was pretty clear to us that in most of the kind of health communication, health promotion, and clinical health services that we were engaging with, the vast majority of professionals didn't have a personal experience of dating app use. They were primarily understanding dating apps through anecdotes shared by friends or clients, perhaps, or media reporting. So we were interested in answering the question, you know, if all you knew about dating apps was what you had seen in the news, what would you know? And that was the rationale for this part of the project. So a high percentage of the articles we found were reports of crime, and of these, about a third focused on sexual assault or rape, but others looked at harassment, personal data leaks, and homophobia. There was another large section that focused on what we would term well-being, and some of this reportage related to mental health, a very large percentage related to sexual health, and then of this, the dominant subset discussed HIV, particularly in relation to gay men. And this is unsurprising because during the time we were collecting this data, PrEP was just being rolled out in many places around the world. But there was another large section of news reporting that we termed safety and play. And this was more often couched in terms of experience as opposed to expertise or reportage. And these were often first-person accounts of playful engagements with dating apps, so hacks, for example, or comedic encounters with apps, relatable public reporting often in places like Junkie or BuzzFeed, pedagogical accounts of app use, and this we termed kind of vernacular pedagogy or everyday pedagogy, and also reflections on the role of mediation in relationships. So while the articles purported to be about dating apps, what they really were about was about the ways that mediation might be changing our sense of intimacy or dating or whatever. And sometimes people, in a very small number of articles, people talked about alternative uses, what we might term off-label uses for apps. So using an app to find a share house, or using an app to meet people when you're traveling, not for sex or relationships, but just, you know, to socialize in a new place. So from this media review, we made some recommendations in the initial stages. We produced a short report first, and then we wrote the article up later. We made some recommendations for health promotion organizations that were seeking to engage with app users in a kind of knowledgeable way. The first was in relation to being conscious of individual and organisational levels of what we've termed digital media literacy, that there needed to be a bit of reflexivity in organisations about literacies relating to news genres and social media, given how much information people were gleaning and sharing through these channels. We also recommended professional development and capacity building be sought out in relation to digital dating and relationship practices. And we also were really interested to see how often health professionals were willing to conflate dating app or hookup app use with increased risk of HIV and STIs, even though there was no evidence anywhere that we could find in our review of scholarly literature that there was a direct correlation. And we suggested that spokespeople for health organisations perhaps need to be a little bit canny when answering leading questions from journalists around hookup apps causing STIs. There's no evidence to suggest this is the case. But finally, I guess our last recommendation related to health promotion, suggesting that there really isn't a need to create a new genre in terms of communicating around sexuality or sexual health when it comes to sex and dating, that people who use apps have already developed really good modes of communication that are all around in popular culture, in memes about dating apps, in short articles, in listicles, in all of those kind of digital first genres that you might imagine. And these are resources that sexuality educators or sexual health promotion organisations can draw on. You don't need to invent these things from scratch. As I said, I'm skimming past this very quickly, but there is more about this in both our report and our article. We asked people which apps they had used most in our survey, and also when we were interviewing people. And this is Australian app users. And apologies, I am moving very quickly through the findings of the project, but I thought I'd give a kind of overview before I do the deep dive into safety. Unsurprisingly, the vast majority of participants were using Tinder, Bumble, OkCupid, Grindr, the most popular apps internationally. But one of the really interesting things for us in our study, and this is what I'm going to delve into more deeply in the second half of the paper, was that when you ask participants, and we did this very explicitly in our study, when we asked people to define safety in their own terms, instead of presenting them, for example, with a validated scale to assess whether they are truly safe or unsafe, or they're doing risky things, these kinds of things. User perceptions of safety and of risk don't align with researcher perceptions, and they certainly don't align with the ways that safety and risk are discussed in literature. So, for example, in the public health literature that we surveyed before we undertook our qualitative research, discussions of safety or risk related to apps were very similar to the conversations we saw in the popular news media. HIV risk, STI risk, risks of sexual assault were talked about a lot, and safety was associated with use of barriers or a kind of self-responsibilization in relation to sexual violence. These things are concerns for app users, we found in our study. But almost no one in our multiple interviews and multiple research workshops talked that much about sexual health in terms of HIV or STIs. Consent and a sense of physical and emotional safety and well-being really took preference precedence in the qualitative conversations. But again, physical and emotional safety weren't necessarily defined by participants in the ways academic literature might define these issues, and certainly not in the ways that, for example, a criminologist might think about safety. App users deployed a range of strategies for establishing a personal sense of safety, and this included what has been termed polymedia use, or the use of multiple apps and platforms to verify the identity of the person they're talking to screen for what might be termed red flags or signals that the person they're talking to may not be who they say they are, or may have a hidden agenda, maybe predatory, maybe racist or transphobic, or, or these kinds of things. People would, the app users, I should say, would use their dating apps in a kind of ecosystem, in a social media ecosystem that also linked up to other platforms like Snapchat or Instagram, or even Facebook in some cases, or SoundCloud. And once they had made a match on Tinder, for example, they might go to Instagram to undertake what you might be thinking of as a kind of second stage verification. So is this person who they say they are? Do their photos on Instagram reveal them to be the kind of person that they are representing themselves as when we chat on the dating app platform? And these were the ways that people negotiated safety through app use. And as I'll expand in the second half of this paper, negotiating consent or negotiating sexual practice and even sexual health were experienced very, very differently according to both the gender and the sexuality of the app users we were talking to, but also according to the norms and conventions of the apps they were using. So the culture of sexual negotiation on Grindr is not the same culture of sexual negotiation that is used on an app like Bumble. It's not the same culture that you might undertake on an app like Field, which is used to set up threesomes or multi-partner encounters. There are actually specific cultures of app use that are quite local. And if you think of apps as an ecosystem almost, or social media as an ecosystem, you might say there are microclimates on particular apps, and people adapt to the climate of the app they're on. So there was no sense that there was a one-size-fits-all app user, or an app that we could universally understand as the template for all apps. It was very, very localized and diverse. And as I said before, app users often communicated with a new match across a range of social platforms in order to verify the identity of a new match and establish trust and intimacy before meeting. App users did talk a bit about their experiences of managing feelings or affect or mental health and well-being. We found, as many other researchers in the field of dating apps have found, that apps were not exclusively used for dating or hooking up. They were used for play, they were used for distraction, they were used for validation. Many of the LGBTQ plus users talked about community. When one of our publications focuses on community. They also talked about friendship, the way they would build new friendships or reinforce existing friendships through app use, and we have another publication focused on that. And for some app users, dating apps were a space that made dating in general, or just socializing, a lot easier, and they made dating feel safer. And some people specifically talked about their experience of social anxiety and how much easier it was to go out or to be social if they knew that they were meeting up with someone they had already matched with on the app, and so they had established a kind of mutual interest or mutual attraction that they could follow up on. This doesn't mean that people didn't experience abuse or harassment. They were abused and they were harassed, and this was definitely the case. And and others experienced frustration and disappointment associated with rejection, or a sense they were failing at app use. And the very kind of bland sentence at the bottom here, these experiences varied according to gender and sexuality of user. They varied in the way you might expect. It was much more likely to be women and trans and non-binary people who were abused or harassed, particularly people who's had other kind of intersecting identities, like being an Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander person or being a person living with disability. These people were much more likely to experience abuse and harassment. The people who experienced distress in relation to failing or rejection or disappointment were much more likely to be cis heterosexual men. And indeed, we undertook a second round of research targeting specifically young cis men, because they seem to be having such a different expression of disappointment on apps than the other groups in the study were experiencing. I won't go into that again in detail. So I've already talked about the ways that apps were part of a social media ecosystem, and that connections between apps and platforms, or disconnections between apps and platforms, could be managed quite strategically by users in order to manage their sense of safety and visibility. Sometimes they wanted to see where they had a mutual friend or friends in common with their match. Sometimes they really didn't want to connect their dating or hooking up activities with their other social activities, and they would very clearly disconnect the app use from other forms of social media. But it was very clear that apps, dating apps, I should say, or hookup apps, don't stand alone. They're very connected to other digital media spaces for most users. And finally, in terms of the takeaway that we really wanted to share with our partners, who were both sexual health promotion organisations and also providing clinical services. In terms of health promotion, this quote from one of our reference group participants, Jolene, really sums it up. It's useful to recognise, reinforce that app dating is just part of regular dating life, and therefore health promotion should fully integrate it into their campaigns rather than it be something niche or different. And this was a really strong takeaway from all of the interviews, that people felt like sexuality education or sexual health promotion resources that they had seen where they did address dating apps were discussed as some kind of separate, risky space, as opposed to being integrated with other aspects of intimacy or friendship or dating life. And that the people who were using apps didn't see apps as a different space. They moved across digital and non-digital dating space in a very fluid way, and they wanted to talk about issues like sexual health or contraception or consent in relation to dating with apps, but they didn't want that to be framed as a separate and risky dating space. They just wanted it to be part of a broader conversation. Just summing up, apps don't define sexual health. App users don't define sexual health solely in terms of STIs, HIV testing and treatment. Safe sex, when we talked about it in our workshops, involved negotiation of sexual boundaries and consent. And both women who had sex with women and women who had sex with men wanted more information in this space, but hadn't seen health promotion content in the apps. We recognized that users who have been marginalized or made vulnerable through kind of other intersectional experiences of ableism, of ageism, of misogyny, for example, were also likely to feel less safe when they were using the apps. But also it was important to understand that apps really help people who are experiencing marginalization or vulnerability access community and friendship. And for this reason, they can be great entry points for asset-based health promotion approaches. So we really recommended, in terms of the findings in the initial stage of the process, that health professionals and app developers, if they were interested in expanding into this space, really focus on a user-centered definition of safety, and that as it relates to safe sex, and to understand that for app users, safety in the sexual health sense is quite holistic. It encompasses contraceptive use, it encompasses personal safety, it encompasses emotional well-being, and that friendship and sexual intimacy are woven together very much in everyday life, and that hookup apps and social media both play a role in weaving them together. They are not separate for app users. That is a lot of research in a very short space. I'm going to stop sharing now. And I'm going to go back to discussing safety as we've been thinking about it more recently. So I'm going to begin by talking a bit about data cultures as it relates to dating apps. And then I'm going to unpack the notion of safety a little more, because I think, you know, while I promised you a discussion of what safety by design would look like in dating apps, I think we need to first understand what the cultures of dating apps involve in a kind of socio-technical sense. So dating apps offer us a really rich terrain for exploring the ways that we are increasingly understanding ourselves and understanding others through data. And dating apps are primarily running on a business model that involves the extraction and circulation of personal data, and also the accumulation of data. So apps are supported by business models that elicit, aggregate, and trade in user data, including gender, location, personal attributes, tastes, sexuality, and relationship preference. And many of the elements of app design that people find problematic in terms of safety, I would say, stem from the business models of the apps themselves. Like social media platforms, which also run on similar business models, apps invite users to populate their profile by contributing and frequently updating personal data. But while users of real name social platforms like Facebook can negotiate workarounds by posting partial or misleading data in their profiles, this is much more difficult for app users. And if you think of some examples of ways that app users try to negotiate the invitation to disclose personal data, for example, by posting a headless torso picture instead of posting a Facebook pic, often this is done by an app user who might want to protect their personal safety or their personal data, if you like, but it is read by other users as deception or a lack of self-disclosure. So it's a real problem for app users when they go to protect their data, because they look like they're being shifty, right? Dating and sexual connection require a large degree of vulnerability and self-disclosure. And how else, if we're meeting through an app, could we ascertain we have a mutual attraction or build trust prior to a physical meeting? You know, we have to share personal data. And this is required to build the trust upon which intimacy rests. But many app users, particularly those who aren't white or cis or able-bodied or heterosexual, in our study and in other studies, report that full disclosure of their face, of their body, of their identity puts them at risk. As Bronwyn Carlson has outlined, Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who disclose their identity on dating apps report high levels of targeted racial abuse. Sexualized racism can take the form of both a kind of abuse and harassment or fetishization of identity. And it's so prevalent on dating apps that mainstream platforms like Bumble and Grindr have developed policies to combat it. And while most platforms, I should say, have still not developed specific policies to support trans people are also exceptionally vulnerable when it comes to the double bind of disclosure and transparency. On one hand, they're accused of being deceptive if they don't disclose their identity. If they do disclose, they're vulnerable to abuse, harassment, fetishization. And this is particularly the case on platforms that offer drop-down menus that allow for a diverse self-identification. So, you can say, I'm non-binary, or I'm gender fluid, or I'm trans. But then when it comes to who you might meet, or who you might be seen by, or who you might match with, the sorting hat that's behind the matching process will only allow you to seek men, seek women, or seek both. And these algorithmic sorting practices are incredibly problematic for people who don't fit binaries. And there are also other elements of data disclosure that can be quite difficult for people on apps, even in Australia, where there are no legal prohibitions against men having sex with men. For example, in other countries, it's far more dangerous to disclose identity on apps. Men's profiles can include details of their HIV status, their preferences for condom use, whether they're using PrEP or not. And this is kind of common and expected on apps like Grindr, for example, but it is absolutely unheard of on women seeking women, or what you might term heterosexual apps. And it's certainly not an affordance in the drop-down menus or profile building spaces on these apps. So there are elements of stigma and kind of cultural norms that circulate in the broader world that also become extra sticky in the dating app context. But I will say, even what you might term flawed or incomplete data cultures can definitely facilitate connection and intimacy. And I don't want to make it sound like dating apps are broken. They are very deeply valued by many of their users, even when they're kind of partial and slightly unsatisfactory in many ways. And it's really interesting, I think, in terms of recent media reports, to see an insistence in many cases that if only everyone was using their real name on dating apps, people would be safer. Or if only they were disclosing all their identity, people would be safer on apps. Because I think it's very clear when you look at the differences in the different cultures of specific apps, or the differences or diversity, you might say, of app users, that it is definitely not the case that there is one way to be safe or unsafe on an app, and that there is one way to fix safety issues relating to apps. And so I might then expand a little bit on the notion of safety before I wrap up the presenting part of the paper and we move into the broader discussion. I should say straight away, I'm not a sociologist of risk, and I'm not planning to go down that road. I'm not a sociologist at all. I'm a media and comms scholar from the space of cultural studies. So that's my caveat before going into this. But I have been looking a bit at the notion of safety because I'm quite interested in problematizing some of these common sense popular conversations about apps as intrinsically unsafe. an understanding of safety obviously is intrinsic to an understanding of risk, but it's been argued that safety has been really under-theorized in relation to risk, which, as we know, kind of is the center of many sociological studies. As Moeller and colleagues have noted, safety is often represented as the inverse of risk, but most risk modelings assume that risk could only be reduced, could only have kind of harm reduction, if you like, as opposed to eliminating risk. So we need to understand that we can only understand safety by acknowledging that risk is always already there. And I think, you know, the kind of old slogans in the HIV space, you know, there's no such thing as safe sex, kind of take us to this consideration of risk and safety. I would argue there's no such thing as safe dating either. In their work, and this is a series of large interdisciplinary studies involving linguists and safety experts and philosophers and so on, kind of interrogating this notion of safety. Moeller and colleagues look at multiple studies that correlate a subjective understanding of risk with a perceived level of control. And I think we're seeing this very much in relation to COVID. So they offer the example, for example, of a person who feels safer when they carry a gun, even though they've seen statistical evidence which says straight out that gun owners are much more likely to be killed or injured than non-gun owners, I guess because they're more likely to get into shootouts. This would be in the US, presumably. So the authors are really interesting in the way they discuss safety. They say, while safety can't be defined or understood in objective or universal terms, I should say, we also need to accept that safety can't be understood as purely subjective either. Instead, they propose a third model of intersubjective safety, in which varying scenarios or states of being are evaluated in relation to one another. So rather than saying this form of dating is safe, this form is risky, the authors argue it would be more appropriate to ask, is this scenario at least as safe as this other scenario, given the relative probabilities of dangerous outcomes? And I think this is a really important question when we're talking about dating app culture and dating apps and whether they're safe or unsafe. Rather than imagining we can answer this in a kind of universal sense, maybe it would be better to say, is dating using apps at least as safe as dating without an app? If it isn't, in what ways might it be more safe? In what ways might it be less safe? And the other concept that we could bring into this conversation around risk and safety is the notion of security, a kind of third term that relates to risk and safety, and I think is a really useful one to consider. So in a related study to this first research that I was discussing, Moeller and colleagues, there is a linguistic analysis of a corpus of everyday uses of the terms risk, safety, and security. And this is, I guess, similar to our dating app study. There's a large database of media uses of the term. And this was compared to a database of expert uses of the terms to compare the kind of ordinary language or everyday language of safety with expert language of safety. And in this study, the researchers found that there are tendencies in ordinary language to associate safety with unintentional harm and security with intentional harm. And this is kind of contrasting, you know, safety as being related to a protective technology like a safety belt, for example, or a safety net. It's protecting you against an accident, whereas security is, you know, protecting us from a data breach or a military attack. Security is more serious and is much more a defense against intentional harm. So if we're considering dating app culture, what might this mean? the authors also talk about the notion of risk in this space, and the ways that risk is discussed in many contexts as something that is desirable. We need to take risks in order to grow and change, that kind of vernacular thing. And they say that we're academics, the authors, I should say, Boham and colleagues, say that we're academics or professionals want to experience or express a technical understanding of risk in a kind of vernacular conversation, they would be better off referring to expected damage as opposed to risk. Because the ways that risk assessment in public health or in other spaces is imagining risk might be very different to the ways that an everyday conversation or an everyday imagination might conceive of risk. So just going back to our study, we invited our participants to tell us about the things that made them feel safer or less safe. So we were talking in many ways about a subjective experience of safety, but also about an intersubjective understanding of safety. And if we're thinking about coding in these spaces, adding a kind of new technological layer like, you know, a consent app or a strategy for identity verification is very much predicated on the notion that the app is intrinsically unsafe and that adding this additional layer or this plugin will make it safer. But I think, as I've kind of tried to touch on here, the question is safer than what? In, I guess, what you might term analog dating, it's quite common to meet people and not know their last name or know all about them before you establish intimacy. Is that intrinsically unsafe? It's quite common not to know where they work, to have a sense that their passport has been verified or whatever. Is that unsafe? Or is there something different about dating apps which make that less safe? So while I kind of promised in my abstract that I was going to explain what could make dating apps safer by design, I don't have a one-size-fits-all model to offer. I can say for sure that more policing and more surveillance is not the answer. First Nations researchers, sex workers, trans people will tell us very emphatically more monitoring and more police surveillance of their use of apps does not make them feel safer. It does not make them objectively safer. The business model of dating apps is based on a kind of process of maximum connection. So there's not a profit to be made from making people safer. But what do people want from dating apps? They do want more transparency. So they want to know who they're messaging and what the other person's understanding of the arrangement might be. They want the ability to curate and filter who they are seen by, as well as who they see. They want to be able to shape their space. And they want responsiveness from the app when they are reporting a problem. And I would say this process is very hard to automate, and it's almost impossible to scale, because a drop-down menu of possible responses from the app developer is not going to answer all the questions that someone has when they're negotiating the in-app environment. I'm going to leave it there because we're almost out of time. I've gone over my 40 minutes, sorry, but I'm very happy to take questions and have a conversation. And if we don't get to it all today, I'm happy to follow up by email later.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Kath. Fascinating research, and you managed to really wonderfully weave together some really complex ideas into a short space of time. If people have got questions, please feel free to raise your hand or pop them in the chat. Kath, I'm not sure if you can see that, but we've got one through from Kurt Thompson. I'll just read out for everyone. Does anything come into covering the psychological differences of how people carry themselves on digital versus analog dating? That is, people find it much easier to be more forward or dishonest more dishonest online versus face-to-face?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I'm not a psychologist. There is a term called the online disinhibition effect. So people that there is a theory that people are more likely to be blunt or rude or direct on apps than they might in a face-to-face setting. I will say, though, having being of the age to have done a lot of pre-digital hanging out in bars and clubs and nightclubs, drunks are also very rude and disinhibited. And I certainly, as a younger person, experienced a fair bit of harassment in public space when I was younger. And I don't know that it was substantially different to the harassment online, except that the person is looking at your face when they do it, and there's a kind of one-to-one connection. So I would say, you know, again, it's anecdotal, but kind of yes, kind of nah. I think some of these conversations where I kind of arc up against them a bit is that they imagine that there's a kind of imaginary space in which dating was fantastic, and particularly heterosexual interactions were really polite and well mannered and transparent, and that everyone was on the same page and had the same agenda. And I don't think that wondrous time ever existed. And apologies for my dog going off in the background.
I always obviously has some passionate opinions on this topic.
She does. She does.
Well, we're waiting for some other questions to come through. I was really interested in the idea of those kind of hyperlocal settings and cultures across the different apps, and particularly in terms of how people might meet people across the apps. In terms of the different cultures of safety, did you get a sense that people were being quite deliberate about how they used different aspects of safety and disclosure and kind of piecing them together?
Yeah, I mean, there were some very good accounts in the qualitative research of people's use of the different spaces. So a couple of the gay men talked about, I'll match on Grindr, but I will only go to someone's house if they've verified their address through an Instagram chat, because then I've seen their Instagram account. I know the photos are the same as the Grindr thing, and they have to give me the address on an Instagram message. If they will only talk to me on Grindr, that's a red flag for me, and I don't feel safe. So there were kind of strategies that people engaged in, moving across the different platforms that they directly referred to as a kind of safety strategy.
Mm-hmm. So we've got a couple more questions in the chat. Sophie Hines has asked, I am wondering how safety in terms of sexual consent was or wasn't negotiated in apps, and how this changed between different genders and sexuality.
Yeah, this came out really strongly, and Chris Dietzel, who worked with us on our project, but also did his PhD in Canada on queer people's understandings of rape culture relating to dating apps, found this too in some of his research. There's kind of a belief in some spaces that if only consent was verbally negotiated in some way on the app or through a third-party plug-in consent app, everything would be clear and great. But there were people who very strongly were happy to negotiate exactly what they did and didn't want to do on the app, and gay men were in the main more comfortable with that. Women were much less comfortable with undertaking a sexual negotiation on the app because they felt like it constituted a contract. So if I say I'm into practice X or practice Y, and then we meet and I don't feel any chemistry with you, have I in some sense committed to doing the thing I said I was into when we meet? And this was women who had sex with women as well as women who had sex with men. It wasn't a concern of one specific group, but people were very wary of explicit sexual negotiation, not even about consent, but just about sexual practices, if they felt like they were going to be painted into a corner in relation to consent later. And there was a sense in which yeah, they really wanted to reserve the right to negotiate face to face once they had a sense of who and what they were dealing with and whether they wanted to take the next step.
So we've got a couple more questions already in the chat, and that might bring us pretty much bang on to 5 o'clock. So kind of a quick one and a thank you from Dion Tagan. Would you mind repeating the name of the scholar who theorised into subjective risk?
Yeah, it is Moller et al. And the publication date, I can actually, I can't put it in the chat now because I'd have to bring it up from the reference list and God knows where it is. But it's a paper published in 2006. I can email it to you, Dion, or other people who want it, because yeah, it was a really interesting discussion of safety, and it actually is really hard if you're looking specifically for work on safety as opposed to risk to find conversations about safety in any literature, really.
Yeah, and such a provocative kind of reframing to talk about expected damage as well. It unlocks a whole lot of different ways of looking at the world. So Nicole Shackleton has asked, did you find that the media discussions of crime impact how people perceive risk on the apps, and was this gendered or based on intersections?
People didn't reference the media reporting much, except to kind of eye roll at it. There were kind of sideline conversations about when we said, you know, what should health promotion organizations know about app use or app users, and one of the men in who used the Men Seeking Men apps was saying, look, please don't tell us to always meet in a public place or something. That is not how we hook up. We go to people's houses. So, you know, telling us to meet, you know, for coffee first is ridiculous. You need to be more specific. Like, you know, this guy was like, I hide my wallet. That's my safety strategy when trade is coming over. Like, come on, be specific about our culture of safety. The crime reporting was generally seen as out of touch with the reality of everyday app use.
And I think this might be our last question from Jackie McMillan. It's expressed appreciation for the analysis of risk as being always there. She says, I recall being told by cab drivers that cabs were much safer than Uber when it first launched, and how annoying that was. Is this the kind of information you see people needing before signing up for a dating app?
Yeah, it's interesting. Again, you know, it's hard to be prescriptive because the thing I haven't talked about too is the age of the user. And this is maybe me, again, being an old person who dated a lot pre-app. But I think there are many complaints about app culture that really are about dating in general, but are kind of ascribed to apps. And so I think, you know, there are specific cultures on specific apps, and they vary according to users. So for example, gay men will tell you Grindr is a hookup app, Tinder is about romance, whereas straight participants say Tinder is for hookups. If you want to, you know, have romantic dates, you need to be on eHarmony or something. So even the same app will be perceived to have a different culture depending on the other aspects of identity of the user. But yeah, I think people do need to understand that self-disclosure is part of the culture of the app in the ways that self-disclosure is part of dating. But there's a whole lot of culture of digital communication that is coming in, and cultures of attention. Like the notions of attention on an app are quite different to the notion of attention one-to-one. So if we think about ghosting or leaving someone on red, or a whole lot of those kind of messaging cultures or digital communication cultures, that they are specific to a digital space, and that's some of the stuff I think people need to be aware of, that dating on apps is different or feels different to dating face to face in some ways that are specific to digital culture.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. So we're right on 5 o'clock or just past, so I might bring us to a close there. Thank you again, Kath, for a really rich conversation today. So the links to all of your publications you showed at the beginning of your presentation, and I know a few of them can be found on your staff profile page at Swinburne as well if people are interested. And thank you for your generous offer too for people to get in touch if they'd like more information.
And the paper specifically talking about safety is a work in progress right now, but Rosalie, Zara and myself are co-authoring and hoping to get it into review very fast. It's not even in review yet. Sorry.
Excellent. Well, one to look out for then, definitely. So our next seminar will be on the 15th of September, rather, and that'll be Professor Catherine Donovan from the University of Durham in the UK. Catherine will be talking about challenging methodological orthodoxies in researching domestic abuse to increase visibility of the domestic abuse experienced by LGB and or T people. So thanks again, Kath, and thanks everyone for joining us today.
Thank you.